G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And the one issue on which I receive by far the most hate from punters and peers alike is the Gaza war and Israel and Palestine. It's extremely heated. I try to be measured. The extent to which people seem to be siloed in their own echo chambers on that particular issue seems to be more intense than almost any other, with the possible exception of the claim that the 2020 election was stolen and how that looms in the minds of Donald Trump supporters. And I suppose the easiest way for me to get clicks and engagement would be to produce a lot of clickbaity clips of me owning some foolish Palestinian person, or me talking to some extremely right-wing Israeli, or me talking to some Hamas sympathizer, or me talking to someone who just generally inflames the discourse. I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in doing that. I think it's tiresome. I think it's boring. I think it contributes to the problem. So today we have an articulate, brilliant, intelligent, and humane, prominent Palestinian. This is a conversation I've wanted to have for a long time. Omar Dajani is just the man to have it with. He's a Palestinian-American professor, and he was a negotiator for the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. In fact, he was at the Camp David summit, which, needless to say, did not succeed in creating a two-state solution, but got reasonably close, and they certainly tried. That was convened by President Bill Clinton in the year 2000. Now, Omar currently co-chairs a non-profit called A Land for All, and it's interesting because it advocates a particular type of two-state solution, not a two-state solution defined by separation, but a two-state solution defined by power sharing. I'll let him articulate exactly what it would look like, but the vision is that instead of Israelis and Palestinians having two antagonistic states hunkered down next to each other, that you would actually reach a point someday where Israelis and Palestinians could live and work on both sides of the 1967 Green Line. And many of the problems that are thrown up by the idea of a two-state solution that is defined by non-porous borders go away the moment you start permitting freedom of work, freedom of movement, and freedom of residency between the two states. Now, that may sound wildly optimistic given how bleak things look at the moment, but you need people like Omar articulating a vision like this to have any hope of its ever happening. I hope you find as inspiring and thought-provoking and challenging as I did this conversation with the one and only Omar Dajani. Has your belief in the desirability or justice or probability of a Palestinian state changed in the past year and a half?
I think it's only become more intense. I think that what the last year and a half has made clear is that Palestinians in a predicament of occupation are incredibly vulnerable. And also that so long as occupation continues, the possibility of violence will always be present. And so I feel that even though the last year and a half has made it harder to achieve the kind of vision that my colleagues at A Land for All and I have been fighting for, I think it's also made it much more urgent.
Mm. Well, give us a sense of your background and where were your parents born and
yeah, sure. So my father was Palestinian. My mother was half Syrian, half French. My father is from Jaffa, which is a city, as you probably know, just below what's now Tel Aviv, and indeed is incorporated now into the city of Tel Aviv. But back in the day, Jaffa was Palestine's leading city. It was the cultural, economic, political center of Palestinian Palestine. My father was born there. He comes from an old and big family. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was part of the delegation that went to plead with Napoleon to show mercy on the local garrison when they infuriated him
I feel like you're
during his
pulling rank
invasion.
here, like ancestry rank. I'll have you know I am a descendant of King Henry VII,
Well,
Omar. Okay,
is
so
that right?
yeah, that is true.
Well,
Yeah. And I'm also a French citizens, so let's we can duke it out.
Well, we have that in common, French citizenship. So, yeah, we may need to do a serious resume comparison.
Yeah, that's right. We'll go to ancestry.com and see who is closest to Napoleon out of the two. So your dad is born in what is now Tel Aviv, and this is pre-48, I assume. And
yeah, he was born in 1932, and so by the time 1948 comes, my dad is 16, and he finishes his high school matriculation exam. And within a few days, everything around him changes. Zionist militias that within a few weeks will become the Israel Defense Forces shell Jaffa from both sides. The population in terror begins fleeing, and that terror is bolstered by the fact that just days earlier, a massacre occurred in the village of Deir Yassin near Jerusalem. So Palestinians are very fearful about what will happen to them. And my father's family decides in the space of a few hours that they will gather just a few things, get on a fishing boat, which they co-own with a partner in my grandfather's business, and sail north. And so they do, and head to Lebanon and then ultimately to Syria. And then, and that's where my father meets my mother. And so, as terrible as these events are, I guess I owe my existence to them. So,
yeah. And I mean, I owe my existence. At the same time that was happening, my paternal grandmother, who'd been fleeing the Nazis through Europe throughout the war, was making her way after the war to the big ships that were piling Jewish refugees onto them and heading to the New World. And she asked the clerk, where can I go? And they said, you can go to America or Canada or Australia. And she said, which one's further from here? And that's why I'm Australian, and that's why my father met my mother, and through such random events, we all owe our lives. So the fear of, just to get straight to the sort of the question of Zionism, right? The fear of the Israeli Zionist hawk is that there's a double standard in the sense that I do not expect any right of return to where my grandmother came from in Poland, yet there's a fear that Palestinians still have their hearts set on your father having a right of return to Jaffa. Is that an unfounded concern?
I don't think it's an unfounded concern, but I think it's an unfounded comparison. So I think that, number one, what's striking, and we're seeing this year, is just how many Israelis actually do have European passports. And that's a consequence of a number of European states, Spain, Poland is one, Germany is another, having said, you know what? These people have connections to this place, and we're going to honor their connection to this place by giving them a citizenship that was wrongfully stripped from them. And that is just. Now, I understand why Zionists sought at the outset a space where Jews would not be a minority again. I understand that Jewish history leaves the Jewish people feeling that minority status is just a prologue to discrimination, persecution, maybe even genocide. The problem, of course, and this is, something that people have talked about endlessly, is that the place they chose as a refuge is a place where millions of people were already living, people who had their own deep connections to the land. So we can take the path of saying either your connection will be honored or our connection will be honored. We can take a path where we say both connections will be honored within the framework of a single state, where there is a competition for power into eternity, which is the path that understandably many Palestinians advocate. They seek a single democratic state of the kind that they're familiar with in other places. But the one that the folks I'm involved with at A Land for All and I advocate is one that walks the middle line that says, yes, it's possible for there to be refugee return, but also for there to be Jewish self-determination. And we achieve that through this framework we call two states, one homeland.
You explain that framework?
Sure. So A Land for All stands for a kind of two-state solution. A Palestinian state would be established alongside Israel with Jerusalem as its capital and the border based on the June 4th, 1967 line. So in that sense, it's very much like the kind of approach that was envisaged during the days when I worked on what used to be called the peace process in 1999, 2000, 2001. How depressing. Right?
What used to be called the peace process.
I know.
Yeah, it's like the artist formerly known as Prince or something. Yeah, the Middle East that used to have a peace process. Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. Except back in the day, Prince's hits were better than the peace process. So it's got all of that in common with the approach that was envisaged there. Two states, and self-determination for two peoples. What makes it different is this. What we look toward is a framework that over time would provide for freedom of movement and ultimately freedom of residence for all Palestinians and Israelis within what is a common homeland. Because at the end of the day, when we think about the space that we're attached to, we're not just thinking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip. My family, as I was telling you, comes from what's now inside Israel. And for many Jews, they think of Judea and Samaria as many Israelis call it, not as some incidental sort of backwater, but as the place where the kingdoms of ancient Israel stood. Our connections to this entire place are deep and longstanding. And so A Land for All honors those connections, but at the same time, what it does is it makes one more move. It severs citizenship and residency, just in the same way that is the case here in Europe, where I am right now. So here, I'm a French citizen like you, and I live part of each year in Greece, where I have residency. And as a Greek resident, I'm allowed to vote in local elections, but I'm not allowed to vote for the Greek National Assembly, though I can vote for the French National Assembly and as an American for the U.S. Congress, right? So my citizenship and residency are severed from each other, but my connection to this local area is maintained. My access to political institutions is maintained through my voice in the municipality. What we want to do in Israel-Palestine is similar, that a Palestinian refugee looking to live in Jaffa would be able to vote in Palestinian national elections, but local elections in Israel. A Jewish settler who currently lives in Ma'ale Adumim would live in what would become an integrated community, not a Jewish-only settlement, but could vote in the Knesset and in the city council, maybe even the provincial government of the area where she lives.
Got it. And so, what are the steps to there? Because that sounds obviously very distant at the moment, given the level of animosity and suspicion that exists between the two ethnicities. How do you get from here to there?
So it's hard, obviously. I think that the first step has to be coming to terms with the fact that occupation, the grinding experience that Palestinians have every day of living under a government that doesn't represent them, to which they don't have access, and that doesn't privilege their rights and liberties, that is a source of, at best, security for one side. And as we saw on October 7th, 2023, very, very incomplete security for all peoples in that space. And so, to my mind, a first step needs to be thinking through a transitional administration that can get us from the point where we are now to the point at which it's possible to begin making steps toward a political transformation. And that transitional administration is something that may take some years to fully do its work that would involve institution building on the Palestinian side, that would involve ensuring that the IDF scales back its presence on a on the basis of regular steps, but also on the basis of security for everyone in the region. That also begins dealing with the humanitarian catastrophe that exists in the Gaza Strip and the real humanitarian issues that are in the West Bank. This is the sort of operation that we see undertaken all over the world all the time.
Like
the main impediment. So if we look at the Balkans, what we saw was the international community step in to ensure that there would be a transition in Kosovo, a transition that ultimately led to Kosovo's independence. We saw something similar in your neighborhood in East Timor, and that affected a transformation from Indonesian occupation to Timorese independence. We saw a similar approach in Cambodia. We have seen again and again across conflict areas in Africa, in South America, the international community stepping in to ensure that as a transition is undertaken, no one actor is able to engage in chaos making, or at least to minimize the chances of that.
Isn't part of the problem that the stakes are so high for whoever puts their hand up to do the international institution building and peacekeeping? I mean, the cynical part of me, or the skeptical part of me perhaps, thinks, well, it would be great if the Arab world would take on the job of policing the Gaza Strip, and it would be great if the Arab world were willing to take on the administration of the West Bank. And ever since 1967, I think certainly a majority of Jews, and probably a majority of Israelis, and definitely a majority of Israeli generals have felt like the occupation is not just a moral stain, but a strategic error and has to end, and have tried to grope towards finding ways of doing that, sometimes insincerely, frequently imperfectly. But as you know, from having been involved in Oslo and having been a negotiator on the Palestinian side yourself, there have been attempts to come to some kind of an accommodation. And if one regards the history of Israel since 2008 as a derailment of Israeli optimism and a sense of Israeli kind of right-wing backlash, fatalism against an impossible situation, then one can imagine a scenario in which a reasonable Israeli, a pre-2008 anti-Netanyahu Israeli, says, where's our help in figuring out what to do with this problem? The Arab states all seem to hate the Palestinians more than we do. They don't want to help them. They don't want to give them work visas. The Lebanon is a basket case. Hezbollah keeps shooting at us. What do you want to? We'd love to get rid of these things. So how do we?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a lot there. So let me just try to unpack a few things. So first of all, at a core level, one of the big mistakes that we made with the process that I was involved in was that we understood ourselves to be making a transition, but we never agreed on either from what or to what we were making a transition. We didn't agree on the status of occupation that existed before. And it took us months before the words Palestinian state were even uttered by Israeli negotiators on the other side. And that lack of clarity about even the broad contours of the ultimate framework that we were headed towards, a lack of clarity not just from Israelis and Palestinians, but also from the international community, meant that it was much easier for spoilers on both sides to say, this process is headed nowhere fast. This process is going to undermine Palestinian rights, or this process is going to undermine Israeli security. What is really crucial is for us to do the opposite, to start from the end, to articulate a vision that is fair, that is responsive to both people's needs and aspirations, that is rooted in values that we across the world have come to regard as fundamental: international human rights and democracy. And to say, okay, listen, we're not there yet, but that's where we're headed. Make no mistake, this is the destination. And then reverse engineer a process to getting there. I think that if you start from the end and work backwards, will have much, much greater chances of success than the other way around. The other thing that it does, and this gets to the point that you're making about third-party intervention, for the Emiratis, for the Saudis, when they're invited in to become the new custodians of Gaza, what they say, and I was in meetings in New York fairly recently with folks from the Saudi government about their vision and their efforts to try to move things in a different direction. What they say is there's no way that we are going to step into a situation like this without any indication that the occupation is going to come to an end, without any clear indication that the outcome is going to be Palestinian statehood and freedom. Otherwise, the target shifts from the Israelis to our backs. And why would we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I mean. But the occupation, do you mean the occupation of any Palestinians? Because the occupation of Gaza obviously ended a long time ago.
Well, I think that the occupation of Gaza,
which is not to justify the blockade and all of the other immiseration of Gazans. I mean, it's a moral catastrophe. You can't require a people to live in open air refugee camps in perpetuity. So I'm not defending that. But when you say that the Arab leaders would be more open if there was a long term plan, I understand that. At the same time, it's understandable that they don't want to go into an enclave where everybody who tries to impose order gets shot in the head by a jihadist death cult. And so there is a worry about the kind of the cultural fabric of the Palestinian culture or the Palestinian people as a result of the failure of the institutions there that makes it a particularly intractable problem.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So first of all, I think that for most of us Palestinians, we don't see that the regime that's existed since Israel redeployed its army out of Gaza in 2005, 2006 constitutes a full end of occupation. And that's where I would urge listeners to check out the website of the Israeli NGO Gisha, which is a really spectacular human rights organization focused on freedom of movement, which says, listen, occupation isn't an on-off switch. It involves degrees of control, and Israel has maintained very significant control, not complete control by all means. Otherwise, Hamas wouldn't have had the latitude that it's had over these last 20 years inside the Strip. But it's maintained very significant control. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind. And of course, you alluded to the lived experience of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip around blockade and its consequences, which have very much affected how Palestinians see Israelis.
I mean, I would just add a note that it would be interesting to see what the blockade looked like, or if it existed, had the Palestinians not elected a jihadist death cult. I mean, if they'd elected a liberal democratic government, then maybe the blockade would be required. Let me push back on the idea of Hamas as a jihadist death cult. I think that while for me what was done on October 7th was repugnant, was morally and legally reprehensible, and I have said that since just a few days after I received the news, there's no question in my mind that they transgressed the boundaries of law and morality on that occasion. But to frame an organization that is trying to lead a people that have been under occupation for 5 decades and that have been disenfranchised from their lands for longer than that, and that is engaged in resistance, some of which is lawful, some of which is clearly unlawful, terrorism, but they do engage in both, that provides services to people and very significant services across the range of areas from health to welfare for Palestinians, to analogize them to jihadist organizations in Iraq and Syria like Al-Qaeda, I think is just
I think it's just a caricature. And I think that it also minimizes the fact that Palestinians have been living under occupation for all this time, that we have been deprived of our freedom during all of this period. And what we are pushing it for is not death. It's not destruction. It's not a cult built around the veneration of murder. It's a cult built around a desire to achieve freedom for people. Now,
but Hamas, I take your point that we should not regard Hamas as being synonymous with Gazans. But just because
not synonymous with Gazans, but also not synonymous with
Al-Qaeda. Yeah, I understand that. But I mean, jihad means more than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. I mean, jihad has a meaning, and Hamas is quite comfortable. I mean, yes, they provide services and health and water. Well, the mafia provides services in areas where it extorts people as well. I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable to regard Gazans as being prisoners, not just of Israel, but of what I would call a jihadist death cult, because I think that's plainly what Sinwar thought that Hamas was. I mean, he spent a lot of time killing Palestinians, and he spent a lot of time butchering, he didn't get his nickname, the Butcher of Khan Yunis, for nothing. He was butchering his fellow Palestinians as well. It was a criminal, if you don't want to call it jihadist, a criminal gang of Jew-hating psychopaths who had no compunction about putting civilians in front of military equipment and being as aggressive as possible towards their foes.
So I find myself in an awkward position because in the days when I was working for the UN there, I used to have a lot of fights with Hamas people. They don't represent, for me, what I hope the future of Palestine will be. And I've pushed back then, and I continue to regarding the ways in which they implement their liberation strategy. I find it deeply problematic. But I also find reductive the way in which you are characterizing them. Yes, they engage in fierce retribution against Palestinians whom they regard as collaborators with the occupation. And what we have seen in other circumstances, I'm not defending killing people unceremoniously without judicial process, but to suggest that it is unique to Palestinians, or rather than being common to pretty much any circumstance of military occupation that you can think of. I mean, my mother-in-law tells me about what things were like in the French resistance during World War II. And there were similar kinds of tactics waged against other French people by French resistance. Similarly, while killing civilians is never acceptable, clearly, as I said a few minutes ago, there's no basis for rationalizing that, even though some people do. I don't think that that's possible. But what I do think is the case is that, we see civilians being sacrificed by a lot of different actors, including the Israeli government, and doing it in circumstances that, for me, really give the lie to the idea that there is an attempt to protect civilians in that context. Now, I don't think that justifies saying, all right, well, this is an actor that we have to wipe off the face of the earth before we can even begin to have a conversation about what the next step looks like. And going back to the topic that we were discussing a little bit earlier, how do we move from where we are now to heading forward? I think it's really important to bear in mind that when Saudis or Emiratis consider whether they should put their toe in, whether they should undertake to, or Egyptians or Jordanians to contribute to the security situation, they're also looking at what Israel is doing in the occupied territory, not just vis-a-vis the security situation, but also with regard to its territorial ambitions. I mean, you'll have seen the news in the last few days of Israel establishing a large corridor in the middle of Gaza and saying that it's not going to be returning that land to the Palestinians anytime soon. And there are some, including those in the Israeli government, who say this is the beginning of precisely what we did in the West Bank, where military areas will be transformed into civilian settlements. And I know you know, Josh, as well as I do, that there are 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem right now. And Palestinians see that as an indication that whatever the talk of of security, that the real motivation behind Israeli actions is territorial aggrandizement. And I know enough Israelis well enough to know that that's not the case for many, many people, but it is the case for many in this government. And so,
but why is this government in power?
Yeah.
I mean, there are religious, there are right-wing maniacs, messianic maniacs in this government who absolutely have no intention of ever tolerating a Palestinian state. And they're in power because of the disillusionment that the Israeli population, which prior to, which 20 years ago was overwhelmingly in favor of a two-state solution and in the aftermath of 1967 had been overwhelmingly in favor of handing back the occupied territories, have become bludgeoned by reality and then literally bludgeoned on October 7th in ways that just made them feel, and just to pause on, before we completely abandon the sort of the minutiae of moralizing about Hamas, it would be remiss of me not to just push back on the French resistance analogy. There is a philosophy in Hamas which is not just about liberation. It really is about the annihilation of an ethnic foe. There is a messianic jihadist strain of radical Islamism, which Sinwar was hellbent on, and Hamas devotees are hellbent on, which sees no problem with annihilating as many of this members of this ethnic group as they possibly can. That really is not akin to my grandfather who fought in the French resistance. I mean, just imagine the thought experiment of what would happen if each party was able to achieve its goals. If the French resistance had been able to achieve its goals, they would have just let all the civilians live and they would have just had a free France and they would have just had the Germans go back across the border. If Hamas could have its goals fulfilled, it would annihilate all the Jews in the Middle East.
So, again, I'm not an expert on Hamas, and I'm not an advocate.
Well, just listen to what Sinwar says.
No, but let's take seriously what Sinwar says and what Hamas has made clear in its charter. One can believe the charter or not, as it's been revised. The way they see the future is they say what we are after is by no means elimination of Jews or genocide. What we are after is regime change.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.